Okay, hello again, everybody. I'm Rick Sanchez, and I want to welcome all of you who are watching us right now from all over the world, whether you're watching on your regular cable or TV provider or the portable TV app. This is the video image that is being talked about all over the world. Look at that. That's a statue of former U.S. President Andrew Jackson being lassoed by protesters in an effort to pull it down. The White House then sent in federalized police to push the protesters back. The story, an explanation of why Andrew Jackson is so reviled. And all of this is coming up right here. But we're going to begin with a bold declaration by China that seems to imply that it simply had enough with, quote, U.S. threats to interfere and will now move forward to de-dollarize and strike back against the United States by creating a global currency to compete with the U.S. dollar. China has long considered joining Russia and fighting back against U.S. control of the world's ability to trade or transfer goods without U.S. interference or say-so. But now China is announcing that it's actually preparing to be cut off from the U.S. financial system, and they're taking what appears to be real steps to protect itself. Why? Or maybe the better question is, why now? Okay? The reason is that while the United States has been heavy-handed in the past, it has never, according to China and Chinese experts and officials, gone so far as to weaponize the U.S. dollar the way that the Trump administration is doing so and threatening to do so now. See, that's why China says that it's doing what it's doing. Even if it shakes up the entire global market, it says it's necessary as a defensive move. One of China's top economic officials seems to be saying that the time for talking is over and now it's time to act. Here's the quote. We have to make preparations early, real preparations, not just psychological preparations. You see, what Fang Xinghai is expressing in that fear is that the Trump administration will do to them what previous administrations have done to Russia with sanctions that have literally locked them out of the world community. What does that mean? Well, what it means is not allowing Russia to exchange goods or currency with other countries. That's a destabilizing thing to do to a country. That type of weaponization of the dollar would be tantamount, figuratively speaking, of course, to an economic nuclear strike, one that would cause unimaginable repercussions, not just in China, but obviously worldwide when China tries to strike back. How serious is the United States about weaponizing the dollar to punish China? How serious and how capable is China in its threat to strike back? This is an important story. If you want to be ahead of the curve in understanding this precarious scenario that could affect you, me, and just about everybody else on the planet, then you'll want to stay tuned as we drill down here on the News with Rick Sanchez, where we're committed, as we often say, to the axiom that it's time to do news again. And here we go, the list of the questions we think you'll be asking tomorrow. How serious are China and the U.S. in their threats of economic warfare? Is Libya once again descending into chaos as the site of an international proxy war? And what is the state of airfare in America right now? But let's go ahead and begin with this, with China and what it's saying, to try and drill down on whether both what they fear and what they're planning to do about that fear is likely. Is the U.S. planning to further weaponize the U.S. dollar by sanctioning China to cut them off from the rest of the global economy? Is China capable of striking back by rallying the world around perhaps its own cause and currency? Joining me now to answer these questions is the co-host of Boom Bust, Christy I. She's the host of Boom Bust and a global market analyst to take us through this. Christy, let's start with China, because I mentioned and what it fears. I mentioned a while ago that the United States has punished other countries, Russia being one of those. But China seems to fear that the United States is going to go even further than it did with Russia. Explain that to us.
Well, China right now is being very proactive and is, as you said earlier when you opened up, is taking a defensive stance right now to prepare for the possibility of being cut off from the US dollar payment system in case the US sanctions Chinese companies and banks. And right now this is perceived as a real risk from China's standpoint because they are quite vulnerable. The US dollar is the world's reserve currency and all trade is conducted in it. So as such, China mainly relies on the US dollar payment system in most of its international dealings. So we've already seen last year, China attempted to trade and settle trades with its neighbors in Russia and India in their own native currencies. And while those test runs were quite successful, it was still on a very small scale. So China is quickly realizing this is a very big vulnerability if things take a nasty turn. So right now they're trying to shift away and be less dependent on the US dollar. But at the same time, this is a very double-edged sword because this move by the U.S. would be perceived as a nuclear option to cut China out of the financial market, to cut it out of the SWIFT network. That will have severe blowbacks on the global economy because cutting China off from SWIFT would be economic suicide. The U.S. currently runs about $350 billion in annual trade deficit with Beijing, and the PBOC holds over $1 trillion in U.S. debt. So the U.S. really can't do without trade with China, then China can do without trade with the U.S.
So it's one thing for the United States to put sanctions on a country and some of its banks, for example. I think that's what happened with Russia, for example. But when they knock you off of SWIFT, that's a much more difficult blow, right? Explain what happens when you get knocked off of SWIFT. What happens to a country? What can it not do?
It essentially means that you are cut off from the entire global monetary network. It means you have no access to liquidity, you have no access to the dollar reserve. You can't send international payments and settlements or pay for anything that are currently settled in US dollar. And most of global international trade currently is denominated in US dollar. That includes oil, that includes agricultural goods, that includes basic supply, food, necessity materials, energy, all of the above. All of that is currently denominated in US dollars. So that would be a very severe blow. And one of the things that you mentioned with Venezuela, even though the U.S. previously, historically, has sanctioned other nations, they cut them off temporarily, as was the case with Iran, it massively hurt their economies. But one of the biggest detriments is the fact that in order to completely cut a country off, other countries have to also comply with the ban. So this is the case with China. If the U.S. wanted to even kick China out of the SWIFT network, people are saying it is highly unlikely because the U.S. would have to get the EU on board to endorse and follow these sanctions. And there's absolutely no reason why the EU would do that when it would hurt their economy. China, as it has proven in this entire coronavirus episode, proved itself to be the manufacturing hub of the world, and they service the EU. So there's no way they would give that up over a dispute that doesn't even involve them.
So what would happen to me as a consumer or a citizen of the United States if tomorrow this kind of situation developed? I mean, we've called it the nuclear option. The United States continues to weaponize the dollar. China finally says we've had enough and does what? And what would be the effect on us?
Well, China right now is not necessarily, as you mentioned, is not creating a different currency. They're trying to just lessen their exposure. And by doing that, they're creating a gold-backed RMB denominated in oil futures contract. So this is essentially a competitor to the SWIFT network, which allows them to send payments internationally and settle trades in their own native currency. So if U.S. were to suddenly blow up and just not have any trade with China whatsoever, that would mean that goods for you as a consumer, an American consumer, that would mean prices of goods would rise exponentially, even more so than the case it was last year with the tariffs.
So we'd be talking about a level of inflation that we haven't seen in, I imagine, quite some time, because the goods would have to be made somewhere else and they'd be more costly, correct?
Absolutely. And in China, while it would certainly wreak havoc on their financial system, because as you can imagine, the Shanghai Exchange, the Hong Kong Hang Seng, those are two of the biggest, largest indexes. And the Hang Seng even outranked the NASDAQ last year. So if you take a look at just the global markets and the amount of capital and liquidity that flows through China each and every day, that is going to wreak complete havoc on how trades are going to be settled.
Seems like something we probably then don't want to see happen for the good of both sides. Christy, thank you so much. Good stuff. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
So now Libya has become the center for a proxy war. You see, some in the international community are calling for a ceasefire and peace negotiations, as others continue to encourage, well, a conflict in what is already a war-torn nation. We've been following this story here on this newscast for quite some time. Here's an update from Alex Mihailovich.
It was a country that boasted one of the highest standards of living in Africa. According to Pan-African news platform The African Exponent, under President Muammar Gaddafi, in Libya, education, healthcare, and even electricity were all free for citizens. Farmers enjoyed a high level of support from the government. Mothers were taken care of after giving birth. Bank loans were interest-free. A home was deemed a natural human right. And the literacy rate jumped from 25% to 75% under Gaddafi. But then along came NATO. In 2011, alliance forces backed a rebellion against Gaddafi's government. That war came to an end when the country's leader was tortured and killed by Western-backed rebels on October 20th, 2011. A gruesome scene, applauded by some.
Yes, we came, we saw, he died.
But it's hard to overlook the fact that chaos has continued in Libya to this day. A variety of players have struggled to control the oil-rich nation. The two most prominent are military commander Khalifa Haftar's Libyan National Army, which has the backing of the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, France, and Russia, and the Tripoli-based government of National Accord, which is supported by the UN, Qatar, Italy, and Turkey. Officially, Libya is under an arms embargo, but somehow weapons keep pouring in. This Monday, Turkey and Italy announced that they are working together to stop the flow. Here's Italy's foreign minister.
If we stop the arrival of arms or we severely limit the entrance, we will be able to reduce the aggressiveness of the two Libyan sides in this conflict.
The same day, France accused its NATO ally, Turkey, of violating the weapons embargo.
I already had the opportunity to clearly say it to President Erdogan. I consider today that Turkey plays in Libya a dangerous game and is in breach of all commitments it took during the Berlin Conference.
With alliance members going head-to-head in regard to Libya, the French president reiterated his statement from last year, calling NATO brain-dead once again. Turkish military interference in Libya has helped the government of National Accord achieve recent gains on the ground, making the situation even more complicated. This past weekend, Egypt's president warned that if Turkish-backed pro-GNA forces advance on the strategic city of Sirte, it could provoke a direct intervention by Cairo. The Turkish-backed GNA has called the announcement a declaration of war. With tension high, many nations, including the U.S. and Russia, are calling for an immediate ceasefire.
We stressed the need for an early ceasefire in Libya and agreed on urging Libyan political forces to engage in constructive dialogue as soon as possible.
If Egypt was provoked to follow through on its threat, it would bring the conflict to a new level. The battleground that has already become an international arena could easily spread into a regional war. For News with Rick Sanchez, I'm Alex Mihailovich.
Is the news with Rick Sanchez. You're watching our special coverage, and we're going to be right back with a follow-up story to one that we brought you just a couple of weeks ago concerning Iran and what it's doing right in our own backyard. We'll be back. Hey, welcome back. You know, we here on the News with Rick Sanchez generally stay away from quoting tabloid sources. But because of the depth and the nature of this particular story, we've decided to share with you this report that is being purported by tabloids both in London and in New York. And it is this. You know Ghislaine Maxwell, right? She's the woman who knowingly provided Jeffrey Epstein with introductions to young female victims who he was later accused of raping. Well, she's been spotted hiding out in Paris. And according to the report, she's been moving periodically to avoid capture, avoid confrontations, I guess, with the FBI. Wow. Joining us now, Lionel of Lionel Media to take us through this story. Lionel, always good to see you. What is your take on this story, first of all? I guess, look, given the fact that it's being put out there by tabloids, the veracity of the story.
First, my dear friend, I would like to reimagine, as they say, they want to defund the police. I want to reimagine the usual and historic bifurcation, Rick, I think, between tabloid and broadsheet or mainstream media news, because we live in a new world, Rick, where, believe it or not, some of the best journalism by a guy with an iPhone. So this tabloid stuff may be, in fact, very, very good, maybe much, much better than one would think initially. So that being said.
Well, by the way, just to touch on that a little bit, I agree with you that there have been stories broken by tabloid publications. I could name several of them, but I would bore you, that the general media never touched on, stay away from, and kind of got their butts kicked on, and then later had to pursue those stories. Point being, generally speaking, tabloid organizations don't adhere to the same journalistic principles and qualifications that most of us do. Now, let's move on to Ghislaine Maxwell.
Right. One of the things in 37 years of practicing law, I've never seen anything like this. The question that I don't understand from people, Rick, from usual conventional mainstream media, is when do you get the chance to talk to Bill Barr? The question is this: General Barr, has Ghislaine Maxwell been offered or given immunity from prosecution?
Yeah.
Number two, can you explain to me why she has not been given, or why she has not been indicted, why she has not been even in custody as a material witness? You know, Rick, if you are not necessarily a subject or even a target or of a grand jury, but you are a material witness and you are likely to flee, likely to go elsewhere, there are ways in which your attendance can be secured that looks identical to being imprisoned, to being incarcerated. And that hasn't even been done.
Forget material, wait a minute, forget material witness, my dear friend.
I said even, right.
But my God, no. We've got witnesses saying she was there, she participated, she recruited them, she practically held the girls down while she was being raped. My goodness.
Right. She was an accomplice. She was a co-defendant. But in my hypothetical, in my psychodrama that I did with you, my dear and great and esteemed friend, my hermano, what I'm saying was, if I was asking Bill Barr something, I'd say, look, General, even if you didn't want to do that, even as a material witness, how is this woman traipsing about, perambulating the world? Now,
I don't get it.
What's interesting is, now, this is what I would tell you if I represented you, and I would tell you as my client, Rick, she is cooperating. This is so far up. In fact, our friend, Mr. Acosta, who was the U.S. attorney for the Southern District of Florida, it was alleged and purported in, perhaps maybe another tabloid, when he was asked, why did you go along with that deal with Epstein and others, including granting immunity to every co-defendant, he said, they are higher up the food chain. It's intel. They're intel. Now, that doesn't preclude them from being prosecuted elsewhere. That's that. So, Rick, I don't want to be cloak and dagger and conspiracy theory, but if I represented you and you were just a garden variety mobster, I'm saying this woman has flipped because, as you know, knowing how this world works, the people who don't get arrested are the ones who are cooperating. So come clean.
Then she's not hiding. She's being protected by sources who are going to use her in some kind of case. Wow, great stuff. All right, good insight. Good insight. Good insight.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you, Lionel. Always a pleasure. Thanks for the laughs.
Thank you, my friend. Thank you, Murray.
Iran is back in the business of rubbing mud in the eyes of the United States, defying all sorts of sanctions by sending a new shipment of goods and supplies to the people of Venezuela. Unlike the previous cargoes, which were mostly in fuel, the latest shipment is food, some of which will be used to open Venezuela's first Iranian supermarket. RT correspondent John Huddy files this story.
The Iranian cargo ship Gulsan, shown here in this photo that the Iranian embassy in Caracas released over the weekend, arrived to the port of La Guaira on Venezuela's coast Sunday, bringing with it food, medical supplies, and reportedly even COVID-19 testing kits. The Iranian embassy in Caracas tweeted that the food will be used to open the, quote, first Iranian supermarket in Venezuela, adding that it will be another success in friendly and fraternal relations between two countries. Perhaps, but it's certainly likely to irk U.S. officials, including Secretary of State Mike Pompeo and President Trump. The U.S. continues to sanction both Iran and Venezuela. And this past March, the Trump administration also indicted Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and several of his current and former top administration officials on drug trafficking charges. even sending U.S. Navy ships to the Caribbean to intercept cocaine smugglers from South America and, according to administration officials, Venezuela. So far, U.S. officials haven't commented on the Iranian cargo ship arriving in Venezuela to reportedly set up the first Iranian supermarket in the country. But President Trump continues to take aim at Maduro, tweeting this June 22nd. Unlike the radical left, I will always stand against socialism and with the people of Venezuela. My administration has always stood on the side of freedom and liberty and against the oppressive Maduro regime. I would only meet with Maduro to discuss one thing, a peaceful exit from power. So far, that meeting has yet to take place and more than likely will not happen anytime soon. We'll keep you posted on that. But back to the Iranian cargo ship, which can carry up to 23,000 tons. Well, it was also said to be carrying parts to help repair Venezuela's collapsed oil refineries. Earlier this month, the Trump administration threatened to sanction as many as 50 Iranian oil and fuel tankers in an effort to cut off trade between Iran and Venezuela after Iranian cargo ships delivered 1.5 million barrels of fuel to Venezuela this past May. For the news with Rick Sanchez, John Huddy.
There's also a political tie to this story. Great report there, John. But you know what I want to do? I want to bring in former MP George Galloway into this conversation because, boy, wouldn't you know it, there's an election coming up in the United States, and apparently Messrs. Biden and Trump are poking each other on the issue of Venezuela about who will be tougher and more anti-communist when it comes to Venezuela. Things sometimes never change. George, what do you make of this?
Well, it's official. Donald Trump is the peace candidate. We know from John Bolton and we now know from Joe Biden that both of those are much hungrier for a harder line against America's enemies than President Donald Trump. They are disappointed with Trump. He hasn't started any new wars. He's withdrawn forces from several theaters, and they fear that in a second term, he would live up to his pre-election promise of ending America's everlasting, never-ending entanglement in foreign wars. And John Bolton's been presented with his pussy hat. He's now officially in the liberal camp. Who'd have thunk it, Rick?
Hey, let me tell you something about American politics that maybe you don't know. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my backyard. I'm from South Florida, being Miami, Fort Lauderdale, that region. The only way that you can become president of the United States these days is to win the state of Florida. To win the state of Florida, you have to win South Florida. To win South Florida, you have to convince the Venezuelans and the Cuban exiles who left Cuba and Venezuela and El Salvador and Nicaragua, all who live there, that you're more anti-communist than anybody. So Clinton did it. Bush did it. This want-to-be president, Biden, is now doing it. Trump did it when he ran for president. They go to Miami, they give a stump speech saying, I will free your country, I'm more anti-communist than anybody else, vote for me. And then they never go back there again, except 1 month until the next election. That's just the way it works, George. I mean, some of this is just politicking, right?
Yes, but what you've just demonstrated earlier is the iron law of unintended consequence. Yeah. The sanctions against Iran have pushed Iran into the Russian orbit. The sanctions against Russia pushed Russia as close as can be, Tweedledee and Tweedledum, with China. Now the sanctions on Iran and Venezuela have pushed Iran and Venezuela together. And you now have the delights to look forward to of shopping in an Iranian supermarket in downtown Caracas. The plan to cut China out of the SWIFT system will swiftly lead to China and Russia coming up with a new payment system which cuts out the dollar and the United States. Careful what you wish for. That's something that I learned in politics a long, long time ago, Rick.
You know, it's interesting when you were saying that, I was almost going to say, you know, you missed one. The sanctions and embargo against Cuba pushed Cuba into Venezuela's embracing arms, which is what started the triad that you just explained. What a wonderful conversation, as usual, with my friend George Galloway. Thank you, George. Appreciate it. Be careful what you wish for. Thank you. Finally, the image that is being seen and talked about around the world, and here it is, once again. That's a statue of Andrew Jackson, a U.S. president, known as much of anything for his cruelty to Native Americans. Last night, protesters threatened and actually attempted to tear his iconic statue in front of the White House until federal police were sent in to push them back. In the end, a small but vocal crowd dispersed. However, by then, the video of these protesters, again, threatening the statue of a former president near the White House, seemed ominous to the entire world. Now I want to give you a little context. Here's a historic point about Andrew Jackson. Despite the fact that he was renowned for his skills as a war general, courageous indeed, he was also responsible when he became president for the Trail of Tears, as it was called, which was the forced removal of Cherokee Creek and Seminole Indians from their lands when gold was found there. It was horrible, it was mean, it was nasty. Jackson was responsible for the deaths of thousands when he sent in federal troops to push them out, even though the Supreme Court had ruled against it, saying it was illegal to do so. But he did it anyway. That's the history. That's the situation. I'm Rick Sanchez, and that's our news. Stay safe, stay connected. Stay with us here on Portable TV, where you can download the app and track the very latest, and take us with you on your phone wherever you go. And we'll see you again when it's once again time to do news again.